Today I'm going to continue with Robert Avens, the new Gnosis, and it's still in chapter 3, which is called Thought of the Heart. And we're continuing to talk about Heidegger, Hillman, maybe a bit of Corbin. Let's see what we talk about today. Have a look at what the description of this ends up being, so I'm not quite sure what we're going to cover. It's section 2 called Animal Gnosis, and let's see what we can find. Quote, Hillman's project, particularly in his later writings, is to return to the heart of the world. He accomplishes this through a new and more imaginative reading of the Greek word aesthesis. In ancient Greek physiology, the root meaning of aesthesis has to do with breathing in or taking in of the world. This reminds me of the term inspire, to inspire, breathe in. As if paraphrasing Heidegger's, quote, being essentiates as appearing, Hillman says that for the Greeks, quote, the being of a thing is revealed in the display of its image. The being of a thing is revealed in the display of its image. Okay, so again, we're talking about James Hillman here, and he's into archetypal phenomenology and archetypal psychology. And the point of this is that we sort of lost a true perception of the way that things are. And this notion of, quote, to return to the heart of the world is to return to a kind of a deeper way of attending, so paying attention in mm, in a way which is in a sense more inspired. So there's a way of that Hillman talks about here of taking in the way that things appear, the images that things present, in a way which is less objectifying, but taking things in as they are. And the claim is that this reveals the being of things. So through in a sense, clearer perception or clearer paying of attention to the way that things appear, we can, in a sense, get closer to the being of things. Let's try and finish the paragraph. Avens says, beauty lies in the shining radiance of things. And the Greek, as well as the Neoplatonic cosmos, in contrast to the Latin universe, and the Greek, as well as the Neoplatonic cosmos, in contrast to the Latin universe, is the manifest anima mundi, soul of the world. Quote, beauty is simply manifestation, the display of phenomena, the appearance of the anima mundi. Okay, so the point of saying these things is to understand what Hillman is pointing us towards. So this is trying to, Avens' text is in a sense trying to corroborate Hillman with Heidegger. And so this way of, in phenomenology, to the things themselves, to return to the way that things are in themselves, here in Hillman, is understood as to the images themselves, or you could say to the archetypes, to the appearances of things. And this return to the way that things appear, the image of things, for Hillman is designed to get us closer to the being of things, their essence, as well as, in a sense, kind of more access, greater access to beauty. But beauty is simply manifestation, the display of phenomena. And also closer to what Hillman calls anima mundi, soul of the world. So there's a way that if we are to see things in a more, in a sense, truthful way, this way involves seeing from out of the soul and seeing the images, the appearances of things in such a way that we notice that those images, those appearances are in fact constituting the soul of the world. We have to try and explore what Hillman means by this, because there's quite a lot to jump into straight away. Let's keep going with Avens. Avens says, what Hillman means by aesthesis and aesthetic response is, quote, closer to an animal sense of the world, and knows for the displayed intelligibility of things, their sound, shape, smell, speaking to and through our heart's reactions, responding to the looks and language, tones and gestures of the things we move among. For Hillman, ontology is in the nose, and phenomenology becomes via aesthetica. So this is a kind of aesthetic way. It's a way of understanding phenomenology through aesthetics, through the way that things appear. I would simply describe this as, in a sense, closer to the unconscious, the nose being the sense of smell, being sort of inherently closer to what Jung would call the inferior function. So what we're talking about is a certain quality of perception, a kind of aesthetic awareness, which is kind of like, it's a quality of perception that is kind of like what you're supposed to do when tasting a glass of wine. It's like having a nose for things. Again, this is pretty far out to just jump into, so we'll try to continue here. Again, we've understood so far through Robert Avens that the term image here, or appearance, or also phenomena, these are in a sense all equivalent or synonymous terms, slightly different, but nevertheless very similar. And angel is another one of those. So when Hillman is talking about sort of archetypal phenomenology, there's a way of returning to the images, returning to the appearances. And this comports well with Corbin's the imaginal, which involves a perception of a sort of personified world that can be conceived in terms of angels, or that's just another term to describe it, the same. Okay, it's difficult to grok, so let's try and continue with Avens and see what he says. Avens says, but what of angels? They too are right here before our animal noses. To a question of an imaginary professor who wonders whether Hillman is identifying instincts with images, the latter, Hillman, replies by evoking a breathtaking panorama of interlocking, dancing thoughts. This is it, he says, in effect. Now we get a quote from Hillman who says, images as instincts, perceived instinctually. The image, a subtle animal. The imagination, a great beast, a subtle body, with ourselves inseparably lodged in its belly. Imagination, an animal mundi, and an anima mundi, both diaphanous and passionate, unerring in its patterns, and in all ways necessary. The necessary angel that makes brute necessity angelic. Imagination, a moving heaven of theriomorphic gods in bestial constellations, stirring without external stimulation within our animal sense as it images its life in our world. Okay, so this has gotten quite arcane quite quickly. So what I have to do is try and describe what is meant here. So what we're talking about is gnosis. We're talking about a certain way of perceiving, a manner of perception, a way of paying attention in the world that it's a phenomenological style. And it's a particular kind of phenomenology. And for Hillman, it's connected with these terms like sense and animal. So I would connect this with the last video, thought of the heart, the term sentience. Sentience. So there's a quality of being deeper within our own awareness or design, being here, that is sort of beneath our rational, cogitating, thinking, analyzing mind, and deeper to simple perception of things. And there's a way that this kind of perception is closer to our animality, our animal nature. And so another way to talk about this is to, when we perceive in that way, there's a way of perceiving things just as they are. And when we perceive things just as they are in that way, rather than interpreting a world behind them or treating them as objects to be manipulated, there's a way that things have character. There's a way that things have their own messages, although that's not quite the right way to put it. It's like everything means something, everything signifies something, everything has a certain character. Everything is saying something in itself. And so this is kind of what is meant by the imaginal world. So I would talk about this quality of existential awareness involving a quality of truthful perception. So perceiving things more truly, perception as in knowing, noesis. And it's a way that's closer to the core of our being, closer to our essence, perceiving from a deeper place within us. And when we do that, when we can see from out of that place, one way of describing that is that we're perceiving from out of the perspective of the soul. It's a kind of soulful perception. And so there's a connection here between the soul and the imaginal. When we see imaginally, we're not seeing in this sort of rational, top-down, objectifying way. We're asking ourselves to enter into a kind of deeper state of awareness. I would think of this as a skill or a certain disposition that can be accessed. And from out of that awareness, from out of that place, we're disposing our attention in a certain way so as to perceive the images of things, so as to perceive the appearances or the phenomena just as they are. And for Hillman and Corbin, this is the imaginal world. It's seeing from out of the soul and seeing images. And there's a way that seeing images is connected inherently with imagination, conceived in an imaginal way. Rather than fantasy, it's about seeing things as they are, not as objects, but as, we could say, persons or characters or angels. And I guess my claim is that this can be practiced. We can practice getting used to this, getting familiar with this way of attending. And that when we can do that, it's not only a way of sort of actively disposing our attention, it's also a way of receiving things as they are, receiving from the world. So it's a way of taking up a certain perspective, for example, the perspective of the soul, and also receiving into that perspective. So that soul is in a world or relates with a world. And that's the world of anima mundi, the world soul. And so this is what I would say that Hillman is referring to. There's a way that when we can take up that perspective, we can understand and see and feel and intuit and sense that everything is speaking to us, that everything has a quality of aliveness that refers to us. And so from this place, from that perception, there's a way of seeing images as in an instinctual way, in an unfiltered way, from out of the depths of our humanity, rather than in a top-down, rationalistic, and in a sense controlling, analyzing way. So I'm going to repeat Hillman's quote. He said, images as instincts perceived instinctually, the image, a subtle animal, the imagination, a great beast, a subtle body, with ourselves inseparably lodged in its belly. Imagination, the animal mundi and an anima mundi, both diaphanous and passionate, unerring in its patterns and in all ways necessary. The necessary angel that makes brute necessity angelic. Imagination, a moving heaven of theriomorphic gods in bestial constellations, stirring without external stimulation within our animal sense as it images its life in our world. Okay, so I will connect a couple of things with this to try and make sense of it in other ways that might be more available or familiar to us. So I would say this is kind of the condition of Jonah, Jonah as in Jonah and the whale. So imagine what it was like for Jonah to be in the belly of the whale. That, well, so the sensation of being within a great beast, something like that. This is kind of what Hillman is describing of what it's like to be within, to be the soul in soul of the world, in a way. So there's a way that the imagination itself is a certain mode. And when we can enter that mode, it's as if we're within the imagination, which can be conceived as a kind of animal. So it's as if we're lodged in the belly of the imagination. What I would connect this with is a quality of the belly is connected with the forge or with the god Vulcan, Hephaestus. So there's a way that the belly is digesting, it's churning. And so there's a quality that the imagination has that is like that. And there's a way that it's a kind of engine of aliveness or an engine of soul or a forge for the soul, I would say. These other qualities that are, in a sense, animalistic that Hillman is describing, I would connect this with the quality of the condition of nature as eating and being eaten. So it's a predator and prey quality. So I would connect that with the uroboros, which is a self-fertilizing and self-consuming snake eating its own tail. So there's a way that this, again, like I was saying with Jonah, there's a way that the condition of Jonah is present here with us, and that in the imagination we get the sense, we can get the sense for that. The same way with this, this dynamics that we see of in the natural world, like eating and being eaten, they're a part of life, right? Well, the idea here is that that's not just a part of life that we see out there, but it's actually an aspect of our existential mode, our being in the world. There's a way that we have this back and forth, generative, I would say, self-consuming relationship with the imagination. So the Ouroboros, or an Ouroboric quality, as a mode of perception that is found within the imagination. Again, the idea being that if we're talking about Hillman's archetypal phenomenology, the idea that the archetypes, a primordial example of which is the Ouroboros, these archetypes actually structure our awareness. They're actually structuring our being in the world. And so this is a way to use phenomenology to try to disclose the aspect of things or the mode of perception that reveals those archetypes as being present. And the imagination, or the imaginal particularly, and this co-transforming relationship between anima and anima mundi is the way to do that. Okay, this one is a bit of a trip, so let's continue with Avens, who says, Hillman's angels, in contrast to the noselessness of the modern technological man, are endowed with real imaginal noses. I have to try and explain what this means. This is terrible, right? It's like, oh no, where is Helen taking us? So there's a way that, again, angels just means images. It just means the way that things appear. So we just have to understand that as it's quite simple. It's literally the way that things look, the way that things show themselves, the way that things shine forth. Again, a good example is with a book because it's an especially clear example. It's like, well, I'm not seeing the whole book. I'm seeing the image. I'm seeing the phenomena. I'm seeing the appearance, or I'm seeing the angel. It's the same way of talking about that. And the idea here is that in our sort of modern technological rationalistic way, we're kind of cut off from our senses. We're cut off from our instinctuality. And that if we can recover the imaginal sense, an imaginal way of being, we recover the capacity to quote unquote scent in this way. So there's a way that imaginal perception, being attuned to the images, the character of things, the way that they appear, is, I would say, also to be attuned to what they mean, what significance they have for us now. Now I have to try and keep going. So Avens was saying Hillman's angels, in contrast to the noselessness of the modern technological man, are endowed with real imaginal noses. Their knowing is free from the constrictions of subjectivism because it is always accompanied by gathered attention to what shows itself by itself and as it is in itself. Okay, so simply what he's saying here is that this is a way of getting deeper than our ego. This is a way of getting deeper than our quote, subjectivity. It's a way of seeing things more clearly as they are. He continues, quote, aesthetic response to things and events demands attentive noticing. We must resurrect, says Hillman, the old idea of noetia as a primary activity of the soul. Quote, to notice each event would limit our appetite for events. And this very slowing down of consumption would affect inflation, hypergrowth, and the manic defenses and expansionism of the civilization. For events speed up in proportion to their not being appreciated. Events grow to cataclysmic size and intensity in proportion to their not being noticed. Okay, so simply what he's talking about here is this quality of noticing. So this aesthetic response to things as they are is a way of cultivating the skill of noticing. It's a way of limiting our appetite. So we're talking about integration. We're talking about really taking things in, digesting things. And so it's a way out of, manic growth, manic consumption. It's a way of really being with things as they are, as they're unfolding. The idea being that things get out of control, out of hand when they're not noticed. Let's continue with Avens, who says, common to both Hillman and Heidegger is the determination to transfer the source of thinking from the Cartesian cogito, quote, to extra-human locations. We must learn to see as animals see. Corbin has observed that certain of our traditions mention that animals see things, which among human beings can be seen only by the visionary mystics. Is it possible that this vision takes place in the absolute mundus archetypus, archetypal world. God alone knows how it is. Okay, so the most important part of this was that the source of our thinking is not anymore going to be the sort of Cartesian ego. There's a way that the thought comes from deeper within us. But when we say extra-human locations, so that reminds me of 4E cognition, so our embedded and extended cognition. There's a way that thinking arises from between the relation between subject and object, self and world. So there's a way that thought is not within us, not coming from inside, but arising between and among ourselves and the world. This is what I would connect with extra-human locations as a source of thought. Again, the most important part was that we must learn to see as animals see. And to me, this is clearly related to ritual, to dance, to drama, to theater, to ceremony. All of this is getting us back in touch with our instinctuality, with our sensitivity, you know. But we'll continue because it's hard to grasp. So Avens says, Hillman prefers to speak of animal faith. Quote, the dog who sniffs the wind doesn't believe in the wind. He simply tries to pick up on it and get what it is saying. Not so simple, by the way. The cat jumps on the tree and starts climbing. The cat has an animal faith in the tree, and it loves the tree, loves itself, loves jumping and climbing. No introspection about belief. Okay, so I would connect the quality of Wu Wei from Chinese thought. So it's a way of not getting stuck in self-reflective awareness. It's a way of not trapping ourselves by attending to ourselves all the time, but going with things as they are. The way that animals have perfect consciousness, perfect faith in the world as it is, no introspection in a way. The idea is that there's a quality of that we've deeply forgotten and could practice recovering. I would also point out that there's a lot of talk here about animality. We also mentioned there was a connection between the imaginal and theriomorphism, the original gods being theriomorphic, like half animal. And what I would connect here is that theriomorphism is one of the oldest aspects of human culture. So pretending to be an animal in ritual, in ceremony. Now, this is something that is very deep to who we are and how we make sense of the world. And something that if we can humble ourselves to realize that we've really forgotten our instinctuality, there's a clear advantages to recovering that. Serious play, again, ritual, dance, drama, theater, ceremony, and clearly in theriomorphism. And I'm drawing that from the Human Origins playlist. So that's an empirical claim that, and even to this day, the cultures that are in some sense can be, in a way, you have to refer to that playlist, but can be mapped as sort of closer to the origins of, or the heart of human culture. Theriomorphism is very widespread, and we can infer from that empirical observation that there are reasons for that there's something important about that. Otherwise, why would it have evolved as a practice, again, across many different cultures? So we were talking about animals and animal faith, the way that they don't have introspection. And Avens says, animal faith is not so simple because it demands a certain submission to the gaze of things. The aesthetic response is not merely something subjective. The world, too, acts aesthetically upon us. We ourselves, as subjects, are subjected to the gaze of things, ourselves a display. To the ensouled world, we, too, are objects of aesthesis, aesthetically breathed in by the anima mundi, perceived by her. Perhaps even aesthetically breathed out as images by an ardent himma, or thought of the heart, in the heart of each thing. I'm going to repeat that sentence. To the ensouled world, we too are objects of aesthesis, aesthetically breathed in by the anima mundi, perceived by her, perhaps even aesthetically breathed out as images by an ardent himmer in the heart of each thing. Okay, this is quite hard to grok, but I'm going to try and bring this into a language where we can understand it. Earlier, we were talking about the myth of Jonah. So imagine that there's not only imagine that that myth, well, it's an archetypal myth. I mean, we see this in Moby Dick, the going into the great beast. This is something that's very primordial and ancient myth, repeated in many different cultures, being swallowed by a giant beast. Well, again, we had the idea earlier through archetypal phenomenology that this isn't just a story, it's actually in a sense, a mode of being. It's a, it's a, it's kind of like an aspect of the way that things are. So there's a quality. I mean, you can even try and get a sense for this. There is a way in which being in life, being in the world, right here, right now, is to be surrounded by a world of things. And look at them, they all have their meaning. Can we get a sense for the way that the wind is moving, or the cars are making noise, or whether the books are looking at you? All the objects, they have a certain meaning. And there's a way that that is all churning together. And it's kind of as if that whole world is a great beast. There's a way that it's as if we're in the middle of the whale right now, like a fish inside a fishbowl. This is what Hillman is talking about. And he's not only talking about that there is something that it's like to be in the fishbowl in that way, to be within the whale, but that there's something that it's like for that whale to have us inside. And I get that this is pretty radical. It's pretty radical. You have to stretch your imagination pretty far to get this. But there's like, if we can really practice, if we can really get that when we can take on this perspective of the soul and inhabit this imaginal world of images, if we can practice that, if we can make that available to ourselves, can we start to appreciate that the world itself is living, that the world itself is in fact can be regarded as reasonably, rationally alive and aware? What would it be like to be aware in that way? So it's a way of cultivating empathic connection with the world, to see things from the point of view of the world. Another analogy, imagine what it's like for a mother to have a child within her womb. There is, in fact, something that it's like for that mother. We can talk to pregnant women and ask them. It's a very interesting sensation, right? Well, if we imagine that the world is the mother like that. Well, there's a way in which we are in the womb of the world. It seems so far out to people. It's like it's really hard for us to get our heads around this. But this is an existential insight that is common to many, 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 many different cultures except ours. We are, in fact, the odd one out. We are, in fact, the reason for that is that we've been cut off from Gnosis. There is this, I would say, a near universal understanding that the world is a kind of creative intelligence that is, in fact, alive, or reasonably regarded as living, and that can be understood, that can be grokked, that can be perceived, that can be received. And so here, there's the notion that if we're to stop our, raping and pillaging of the earth, if we're to stop ecocide, if we're to stop the forgetting of being that Heidegger describes, can we be open to the existential awareness that there is something that it's like for the world to have us be here? If we can grok things in that way, then there's a way that we too are images. So look, we didn't decide the way that we are. Nature decided. We're given. We're given. They just your parents decide to have a child, and it's kind of potluck about who you get. So there's a way that if you imagine the Earth Mother, Gaia. This is kind of the Gaia hypothesis kind of thing. Um, Imagine that nature has agency as that which selects nature, Mother Nature, and that she breathes in and out as we breathe in and out. Um, a good take on this is Terrence Mallick. There's a film. It's called Voyage of Time. Terrence Mallick, Voyage of Time. I would really recommend there's a 40-minute long version narrated by Brad Pitt, and there's a 90-minute long version narrated by Kate Blanchett, and I would really recommend that. And it's a way of getting at aesthetically what it's like to perceive that the world is alive and that the world breathes. And so there's a way that if we can appreciate that, when the world breathes out, she breathes out in the form of images, forms of life, appearances. So she's saying kind of like this, and kind of like this, and kind of like this, and kind of like this. And I mean, nature goes through. It's these breathing cycles of reproduction and selection, of reproduction and selection. That's breathing. And so this is a way of perceiving Mother Nature, or what's known as anima mundi, soul of the world, as from the point of view of archetypal phenomenology, that she actually has a kind of aesthetic appreciation and breathes out images in this way, breathes out people in this way, so that we are here, so that we live, so that we be. This isn't something to believe, it's something to know in the sense of Jung's interview close to the end of his life. He doesn't believe, he knows. He knows. I also connected here, like Avens says, the aesthetic response is based on a relationship of reciprocity between man and world, between the human soul and the soul of the world, between Dasein and being. And so for me, this is connected here with this again, opponent processing kind of reciprocal opening dynamic with the world. Viveki has made much of this, but there's a quality of symbiosis or mutualism that's implied here. So there's a way that the agent arena relationship, our coupling with the world, has a symbiotic or mutualistic quality. The idea being, I mean, look, why are humans here? Why did we evolve? The idea being that we perform some service, some benefit to what is called Mother Nature. We're, in a sense, the consciousness organ of nature. Because the bees do their thing and the sharks do their thing, and there's like a space of possible minds, and each of them is fulfilling a different kind of fractal within that space. And well, humans are doing a thing too. What are humans doing? Well, they're doing the human consciousness thing. So there's a kind of a notion of a relationship of reciprocity between anima and anima mundi, man and the world. Our being and the being of the world, which is symbiotic or mutualistic, reciprocal, that can be perceived and lived through intentional practice, not only in psychedelia, but also in, with the right ecology of practices and practicing archetypal phenomenology in some of the ways that I've described here and elsewhere. Let's keep going. Avens says, according to Hillman, the individual soul is immediately tied to the world soul. Any alteration in the human psyche resonates with a change in the psyche of the world. the integral phenomenon and the ontological prius are neither man nor world, but are belonging together in an inscrutable third thing. Okay, so this is simply the idea that the change in one is change in the other, that they're changed together, that they are both, that they belong together, that our separation between self and world, or soul and anima mundi, is artificial and derivative. Or you could say egoic. Let's continue with Avens, who says, quote, "It was suggested earlier that angels have no message because they themselves are the message. It's the same with animals. Like angels, they don't have to tell stories. They just show themselves. They are like images. They are images." So again, I've understood angels as images or phenomena, the way that things appear. And again, this is a certain a mode of perception, which is seeing things just as they are, in the same way that animals are. Like they just are how they are. They don't have a story to tell. They're just showing themselves. They're just being there. Quote, "The juxtaposition of animals and angels in the Hillmanian Gnosis is not an arbitrary exercise designed to shock our fragile sensibilities. Hillman merely wants to emphasize that imagination is not a separate faculty operating on its own. It always, quote, works through, behind, within, upon, and below our faculties. So imagination isn't something separate from the rest of our being. Imagination is built in to the way that we do things. Quote, "It's like a permeating ether that dissolves the very possibilities of separate faculties, functions, and realms." Okay, so the in some way the imagination is like the air. You know, it surrounds and binds us like the force. So it's not something that's like we have our thinking, we have our feeling, we have our sensing, we have our intuiting, and we have our imagination. It's not like that. There's an idea that all of our different, let's say, faculties can be more or less imaginative, can be more or less infused with imagination. Okay, let's keep going. Heidegger repudiates aesthetics for reasons that Hillman could certainly make his own. In Heidegger's view, aesthetics is one more disastrous result of our distinctions between sensuous and the suprasensuous, subject and object, and the other distinctions which flow from Plato's original disjunction of physis and idea. Okay, so we're going to keep going here until we find something else that's interesting enough to go into. But we were talking earlier about aesthetics in a positive way, in terms of aesthetic response to things, demanding this kind of attentive noticing. This is kind of aesthetic awareness, which is based on a relationship of reciprocity between soul and soul of the world. And now Heidegger, rather than Hillman, who we were talking about, Heidegger wants to reject or repudiate a certain notion of aesthetics. And we're trying to understand what that notion is. Because again, I think here we're probably trying to avoid the romantic tradition, right? It's this idea of aesthetics through the imagination is not about romantically expressing our meaning, projecting our desires onto the world. Images are here understood as works of nature, not artworks. And so Heidegger rejects a certain notion of aesthetics that is apparently dependent on these different distinctions. And we're trying to work out what Heidegger is rejecting. And Avens says, specifically, what Heidegger rejects is classical sensationalist psychology. through people like Locke, Herbart, Fechner, Bentham, and Freud. And Avens says, so what Heidegger rejects is classical sensationalist psychology that, in Hillman's words, takes one away from the concrete and immediate through elaborate formulations into laws, principles, and mathematics. These psychologies advocate sensation in the service of reason instead of sensation experienced through the imagination. According to Heidegger, the classical aesthetics reduce the immediacy of a thing to the aestheton. That is, that which is perceptible by sensations in the senses belonging to sensibility, or the unity of a manifold of what is given in the senses. It's otherwise conceived of a throng of sensations. This is a really difficult section, so I'm not going to get too hung up on it. So Heidegger is pushing back on this. He's saying that again, Heidegger is rejecting a traditional notion of aesthetics, which reduces the immediacy of a thing to the aestheton, which is a throng of sensations. And so this traditional distinction is made between the real as sensuous and the ideal as non-sensuous, which is like the real as that which is material or sensed, whereas the ideal is not sensed, literally nonsense. Quote, the traditional aesthetics is grounded in metaphysics, or in Hillman's words, has put sensation in the service of reason. Okay, that's all what we were wanting to reject following Heidegger. These distinctions between real as sensuous and ideal as non-sensuous, where sensation is put in the service of reason, which is pushing back on the original Platonic disjunction of physis and idea. Okay, so now we're going to, through Avens, well, through Hillman, we've been looking at the imagination, and in Heidegger, we're trying to get a corresponding term to imagination. So where Hillman uses the term imagination, what might Heidegger use? Avens says, if we're looking for a word that in Heidegger corresponds more closely to imagination in archetypal psychology, it's advisable to use his term Besinnung. For if it is true that, as Hillman repeatedly stresses, imagination takes place within the senses, then the German word Besinnung, from Sinn, S-I-N-N, combining both senses and meaning, it denotes a kind of sensuous thinking or spiritual perception, whose main characteristic is releasement, Gelassenheit, or openness towards things. So I would describe this with the quality of listening or receiving. So this term, Besinnung, in Heidegger, is somewhat corresponding to imagination in Hillman's archetypal psychology. And this Heidegger's term has characteristics of sensuous thinking, combining sensing and meaning. As a quality, it's like spiritual perception, and involves the characteristic of releasement, Gelassenheit, or openness towards things. Quote, like the Taoist action through non-action, it points to a kind of waiting that is beyond the distinction between activity and passivity. In waiting, we leave open what we're waiting for and merely attend or stretch toward what is going on. So again, this is connected with in the section on thought of the heart, which was video 13. This is connected with waiting upon, as in the way that a bridegroom waits upon a bride the way that a shepherd waits upon his sheep in a certain way. Okay, so essentially, this is simply Heidegger's term that is sort of equivalent to the imagination in Hillman. And it has to do with what we were talking about last time, is between active and passive. And again, between subject and object. Having these characteristics of releasement, openness towards things, and waiting upon, which is not waiting for the sake of something, but waiting in such a way as to perceive things as they are, to get closer to things as they're actually happening. Quote, in contrast to calculative thinking, which deals with things in terms of personal advantage, Besinnung, which is really the same as meditative thinking, again, which we were talking about last time, involves direct and immediate reference beyond man to being, i.e., to things as they are in their concrete, tangible aspectivity. Essentially, to things as they are, perceiving clearly. As Heidegger has it, we do not receive sensations because we have sensuous organs. Rather, we can have sensuous organs because we're already sensitive beings. Ultimately, the essence of sensitivity lies in the fact that we are finite. We can know and perceive the world because we are a priori worldly or ecstatic, self-exceeding. We know the world because our personal soul is, from the very outset, related to the world soul. That's actually the end of the section. So let's see if I can derive anything more from this here. The way to do this is to note that this is connected with what we were talking about earlier. We were talking about this reciprocal feedback loop between the soul and soul of the world, or between man and world, in the context of the talking about Jonah and the whale. And so there's simply a way here of understanding that that relationship, that feedback loop between self and world, comes first in a certain way, and we gain the capacity for sensation from out of that relationship. We gain knowledge from out of that relationship. Another way of describing it is that we have an ecstatic nature. We're self-exceeding. Again, we can know and perceive the world because we are a priori worldly or self-exceeding, ecstatic. We know the world because our personal soul is from the very outset related to the world soul. So rather than having these sensory organs and perceiving from out of them, like rather than our sensations coming out of our sensory organs, there's a way that our capacity for sensation at all derives from out of this reciprocal relationship with the world. And because of that quality, we then gain sensuous organs in a way. Well, this was a real trip going through this part of Heidegger's thought. So I'm simply going to leave this where it is. Take from this what you can. And I'll come back to chapter 4, language, poetry, art, with section 1, language as the saying of the gods, which might be a little bit more accessible.